Good evening, everybody. My name is Professor Stephen McKinney of the University of Glasgow, and on behalf of the Mediaeval Glasgow Trust, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural event of the St Mungo Festival 2021. As you will have noticed, we have had to move the festival online, but we're still presenting a very full and varied programme of events. Now, you can access further info on Facebook, Twitter, and the Mediaeval Glasgow Trust website, and there are some fantastic events coming up over the next 2 weeks. Our inaugural event is a lecture by Professor Carruthers, who is the Francis Hutchison Chair of Scottish Literature. Gerry is a very enthusiastic and committed scholar in Scottish literature and history. He's a well-known expert in Robert Burns and is much in demand for Burns clubs and Burns suppers, but is a very well-known scholar in the literature of Burns. He's a very much loved figure in the university and a good friend to many. And I think it's fair to say, never one to shy away from a robust argument. This evening, Gerry is going to deliver a lecture on Medieval Glasgow in Scottish literature. The format will be, we have already pre-recorded the lecture, which we will show now. Once that has been completed, Gerry will be available for questions and discussion. And when we come to that stage, roughly half an hour, I would ask you to use the question and answer function, please. So, with enormous pleasure, I welcome Professor Gerry Carruthers.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to deliver this evening's St Mungo lecture. Thank you very much to the organising committee for asking me to do this, on the theme of medieval Glasgow in Scottish literature. And I'm going to look at literature. I'm going to range a wee bit more widely in an area that we might in general call cultural memory, to try and retrieve medieval Glasgow. In some ways, it's quite a straightforward story. In other ways, perhaps a complicated story. And we might start, as so many accounts of Glasgow do, by thinking about what Glasgow means. And we all know the usual cliche drifts that are going through. Dear green place, probably not. Green hollow, grey-green, grey-blue, maybe a bit of both to be ecumenical. Is it even a derivation from Glasgerion? Glasgerion was the king's son, a harper, who hung around trees arranging dodgy dates. And he's a character who crops up in both Gavin Douglas's The Palace of Honour in 1501 and Geoffrey Chaucer's The House of Fame, written in the 1370s. Glasgow, previously known, before that Gaelic incarnation of its name, if that's what it is, in the Welsh version, Carruthers. In 2002, Edwin Morgan, the Glasgow Macker, produces a collection of poems called Carruthers, which reflects on Glasgow through the ages, which reflects on Glasgow in the present. And what Eddie Morgan was doing there was thinking about the way in which places and landscapes are palimpsests. They are overwritten with history and memory and words. And incidentally, Eddie Morgan, Glasgow's Macker, eventually the first Scottish Macker, that medieval Scots word for a poet coming from the Greek, maker, it was something that Eddie Morgan was, I think, a wee bit embarrassed about, or didn't entirely believe in. He felt perhaps that it was a bit forced, bringing back this very heavily Scots identity onto, as it were, the poet laureate of Glasgow or Scotland's. But I think it is interesting that that medieval presence in that word macker comes back in Glasgow, in Scotland in general. It never quite goes away. It's reiterated in the 21st century. And so too, Eddie Morgan in Carruthers reaches back even before the idea of the macker to rely on that Welsh name for Glasgow. So, what's in a name? What's in a place? What's in a literature? If we think about Glaswegian literature, we might go back to the 12th century and look at a foundational text, and that is Jocelyn's Life of Kentigern, written round about 1185. Now, slightly confusingly, there are two Jocelyns. One is a Cistercian monk from Cumbria, who's commissioned to write the life of Kentigern or Mungo, and the other Jocelyn, the man commissioning it, is the Bishop of Glasgow. And what we're talking about here is a foundational text. Let's have a life of the saint, because if we get a life of the saint, that gives us a foundation idea of Glasgow. And Jocelyn's Life of Kentigern indeed tells us about Carruthers, now called Glasgow, tells us about Kentigern or Mungo, who meets St Ninian from the southwest, or associated with the southwest. This is about bigging Mungo or Kentigern up. He's in the top division of saints with guys like St Ninian. He eventually meets Columba. He's the son of St Enoch, and of course that's another name that we have in the Scottish landscape. And in this period in the 12th century, we have Glasgow, like other places, very much in its coinage having a literature of saints, a literature of religion. In this medieval period of the 12th century, it's not about poetry in Scots, it's not poetry about martial heroes, warriors like Bruce and Wallace, who haven't appeared in the scene quite yet. It is about saints and bishops. In 1998, a colleague at the University of Glasgow, Thomas Owen Clancy, produced his anthology, The Triumph Tree. And that was a lovely revisionist collection that, if you look at the arc in the material, it goes from material in Latin, in Norse, in Welsh, in other forms of Gaelic, and only toward the end of that book do you get poetry in Scots, poetry celebrating King Alexander, or indeed the likes of Bruce and Wallace. In other words, the Scots language is a Johnny-come-lately. And if we look at Glasgow in the medieval period, if we go back for texts that speak about Glasgow in any real sense, we are indeed talking about Latin texts. One of the texts included by Thomas Clancy is the Latin Song on the Death of Somerled. Somerled was the son of Gilabregia, and a man who had pledged his allegiance to King David, but then attempted with his own bunch of troops and mercenaries, it seems, raided the west coast of Scotland, wreaking havoc with his men, sometimes from Ireland, from Orkney, from the Outer Isles, etc., etc. And at some point toward the end of the 12th century, William Clark of Glasgow, William, a priest probably associated with Glasgow Cathedral, writes his Song on the Death of Somerled in Latin. David lay entombed when the treachery of scheming Scots emerged, Norsemen and Argylesmen who leaned on Scotland's might, raging slaughtered righteous men with cruel hands. A cleric hacked off the head of the wretched leader Somerled and placed it into Bishop Herbert's outstretched hands. He said, "The Scottish saints are surely to be praised." And the kind of background to that song is that Kentigern or Mungo is berated by Bishop Herbert. He says, like, these guys are running amok. Why are you not helping us? And eventually St Mungo helps out. The forces of Somerled are defeated. His head is cut off by a priest. That's the kind of strong parish priest you want, in my view. And this is presented to the bishop. So very much at this point, songs of war, literature about great military martial deeds, but interestingly, the way in which the clergy and saints are involved in this around the cathedral. If we think about that topography of old Glasgow, of medieval Glasgow, coming forward a couple of centuries, around the cathedral, established, it seems, by Mungo, by Kentigern, we have the original site of the University of Glasgow, 1451, established by the papal bull of Nicholas V. Its original site, of course, the old college, very close to the cathedral, perhaps established by the Dominicans or the Franciscans. That's a bit of a debate that rages. Again, we should be aware of the clerical nature of the foundation of the university. Church and university go together. And although in some ways people suggest there's a radical break with the Reformation, and there kind of is, down to and beyond the Enlightenment period, we're still talking about academics as often as not at the University of Glasgow and in other ancient universities being clerics, being clergymen. Sometimes there's more continuity than we might think. With the Reformation, of course, after 1560, we have the cathedral to some extent falling into disuse. And although the historical record is a bit mythical, is a bit debated, it seems that Trades House, the tradesmen, resisted attempts for the cathedral to be broken up so that its stone could be used in other buildings. And this is celebrated in a painting by David Roberts, Defence of the Cathedral by the Trades House in 1579 during the Reformation. This might not actually have happened, but this 19th century painting celebrates something that has some truth. And the other thing that we'll also come back to is we notice that medieval identity of Glasgow coming back into currency again in the later 19th century. Before we get there, if we think about medieval Glasgow in the early 19th century, we might turn to John Galt's. Now, my particular bit of heresy, I think that the greatest historical novelist ever produced by Scotland is not Walter Scott, fan of Scott though I am, but John Galt. John Galt produces his Ring and Gillis, which follows several generations of a family through the Reformation, through the period of Covenanting, through religious wars. And that in that wonderful, sprawling historical novel, Ring and Gillis believes in fate, he believes in destiny, he believes in the hand of God. Not all that different from the kind of thing that we're getting in the Song of Somerled, the idea that God is taking a hand in things. And in this late medieval period, if we can call the Reformation that, and I think we probably can, we have in Ring and Gillis the Battle of Langsides. We have Mary Queen of Scots featuring. And this is a novel that comes out of the 18th century Enlightenment in some ways, at the tail end of the Enlightenment, we're into the 1820s. And John Galt displays implicitly sympathy not only for Ring and Gillis, the reformer, but for Mary Queen of Scots, the Catholic monarch. And that's what the Enlightenment does, or one of the things it does. It suggests that we should think about different kinds of identities. We should see other people sympathetically. A lot of this comes from Adam Smith, an academic at the University of Glasgow in the mid-18th century, of course. Galt writes his theoretical histories that put fictional characters into real historical situations with great sympathy, shows us the sweep of history, and Ring and Gillis gives us a number of tantalising glances of the Glasgow area and the western counties of Scotland in general. Just in passing, I might mention his great Glasgow novel, The Entail, set more or less in his own times, about the commercial Glasgow. The commercial Glasgow that is classically seen as following on from the ecclesiastical Glasgow precipitated by the Reformation, etc. That's a kind of standard narrative. We need to be careful of it. There are more continuities than we think, but Galt in these novels shows us Glasgow, and Ring Gillis is something that we should pay attention to if we want to read about medieval Glasgow. Now, during the 19th century, what we have, as I've mentioned already, is the resurfacing of the medieval identity. And we have a number of iterations of Mary of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, who I mentioned a moment ago. We've got the painting, the version by F. Hartwich, after an illustration by Landseer. Mary of Scotland mourning over the dying Douglas at the Battle of Langside 1568, which is historically completely wrong, because Douglas doesn't die at that battle, but Walter Scott in his novel The Abbot had made him die in that battle. So here we've got fiction, including fiction and painting, distorting real life, and fiction taking over. What is interesting is that medieval canopy, if you like, with queens and bishops, indeed with cathedrals, that kind of stuff comes back into public view in the 19th century in Scotland. We'll say more about that again as we go on. Some years ago, I more or less rediscovered the manuscript poetry of William Campbell, a man who frequently wrote poetry that was contributed to the Glasgow Advertiser, the forerunner of the Herald. And William Campbell, writing in the 1790s, is interesting about Old Glasgow. He will mention the cathedral, the infirmary, the bishop's palace. He's involved in the building of the new infirmary. And in one poem, he describes what is going on as the infirmary is rebuilt. No more the impending wall offends our eyes, a nobler, happier dome is seen to rise, whose milder aspect bids contention cease, and soothes the mind to harmony and peace. The hostile banner shall approach no more, nor shall the cannon with tremendous roar from this now peaceful fabric e'er be found, to deal destruction on its foes around. More grateful triumphs now shall grace its page, the triumphs of a philanthropic age, which deems humanity superior far to the most splendid trophies gained in war. Restored to health, the once afflicted poor, with grateful hearts, shall issue from its door. A piece of wishful thinking from William Campbell, writing not long after the French Revolution. War will be done away with, everything will be peaceful. Well, of course, we know that isn't the truth, not in Glasgow, not in anywhere, but the poetic conceit is that the walls of the bishop's palace, and there may be a wee bit of sectarianism going on here, but the walls of the bishop's palace come down, the walls of the old fortified city are coming down, and instead we have a hospital, and this is new and wonderful. And to some extent that's true, except that we should be aware of the infirmary provision in the medieval period by clerics around the cathedral. This had always gone on. It isn't actually a new innovation. Interesting then the way in which medieval Glasgow is being written about, being cast aside poetically by William Campbell, but actually what he's writing about, strangely, is a ghost, or what he reinserts as the ghost of something that was there already, into his vision of the present, into his vision of the progressive Glasgow, where the poor and the infirm are cared for. To a great degree, there isn't a lot of actual medieval literature about Glasgow, and I think the bottom line for that, to explain that, is that the court is in places like Stirling and in Edinburgh in the medieval period. It's not in Glasgow. And the court promotes poetry. It's the centre of poetry. After the ecclesiastical centres are no longer so important in an earlier medieval period, attention switches to the court. The court isn't in Glasgow. There really isn't an awful lot of medieval literature about Glasgow. But it's interesting that we see that medieval identity of Glasgow coming back through the literature gradually, including, as I say, in the 19th century. And I want to turn to a radical Scottish poet involved in the 1820 Scottish Radical War, as it came to be known. And that poet and journalist is Alexander Roger, a man buried up in the necropolis whose work deserves to be better known. And Roger, interestingly, in the early 19th century, in the first decades, celebrates St Mungo. This 19th century that Roger inhabits is when medieval Glasgow, the identity of medieval Glasgow, is kind of permissible again, it's kind of allowed. Here's a couple of stanzas from his poem, St Mungo. St Mungo was on famous sanct, and in canty carol was he drank a Mollendiner burn, when better he couldna pree. Yet when he could get stronger cheer, he ne'er was watery dry, but drank ye stream ye wimpling worm, and look ye burn round by. St Mungo was in merry sanct, and merrily he sang, whene'er he lilted up his spring, ye very fir part rang, but though he weel could lilt and sing, on mak sweet melody, he chaunted aye the boldest strains, when primed wi' barley bree. Now what we've got going on here is something that we get from the time of Robert Burns and other poets like Robert Tannahill. You get a bit of this in Walter Scott, you're a bit even earlier in Alan Ramsay. We begin to get a mimicking of Middle Scots, of medieval Scottish literature. And Alexander Roger joins in here to celebrate St Mungo and the Mollendiner burn, and he has a note in the poem explaining that this is now covered over. Virtually only the fire brigade these days know where the Mollendiner burn is, which they kind of need to know in case they need a source of water. Roger, as he writes about St Mungo, sees him as a merry saint who sometimes enjoys whiskey. I'm not sure if that comes from Jocelyn's account of Kentigern or not, but we've got something in there where he says Mungo counts the beads of barley just as he counts the beads on his rosary. And at that point, I think Roger, the big-hearted radical, I don't think that is kind of a reference to bead rattling in the kind of sectarian terminology. I think what we've got going on here is simply bringing back into view medieval customs, the customs of an older Christianity, of medieval Catholicism. And that poem, St Mungo, inhabiting that Middle Scots cadence, deserves, I think, to be better known. As the 19th century progresses, Glasgow becomes even more medieval than it ever was, we might suggest. If you look at the Gothic pile of the University of Glasgow at Gilmore Hill from the 1870s, we have the tower, we have the cloisters. Why would you want a cloister in the late 19th century? But we have one. And of course, we have the Bute Hall with its fine arched neo-Gothic architecture. And a lot of this has to do, of course, with the patronage of the Marquis of Bute, Bute Hall at Glasgow University, John Crichton Stuart III Marquis, who, when he converts to Catholicism, age 21, this causes a national scandal and leads to the novel Lothair by Disraeli. But the Marquis of Bute in Glasgow and elsewhere is very intent on funding the Gothic revival. And he's only one particularly wealthy one of a number of people who are intent on bringing back that medieval presence. If we think about the west of Scotland more broadly, we might consider Paisley Abbey, once a Cluniac monastery from the 12th century. It begins to be reconstructed really from the 1870s. If we think about Glasgow Cathedral, we're talking really from the 1850s to the 1920s. It is built up again. It had never been destroyed totally or anything like totally in the Reformation, but it's built up again. It becomes whole again, if you like, because Glasgow, like the rest of Scotland, isn't really all that squeamish any longer about its pre-Reformation identity. And I mentioned already Walter Scott, who quite rightly is seen as establishing baronial Gothic in his own home at Abbotsford, and in his novels A Taste for the Medieval. Scott is a large part of the license that's given to Scotland to rememorise or rememorialise and remember and recapture its medieval identity. Glasgow Cathedral and Glasgow generally features in Scott's novel Rob Roy in 1818, and that again shows that cultural memory is becoming more expansive, more relaxed in some ways, if you like, so that, my goodness, at some point in the 19th century, Glasgow Cathedral, the High Kirk, that great Presbyterian centre, even has, heaven forfend, a director of music. So there are things going on, and these are European broadly, they're British broadly, they're also Scottish, where the medieval is reinscribed in culture, and this is certainly happening in Glasgow. And that story goes on into the 20th century, from the 19th century, especially the Gothic Revival. And we have, for instance, the cheerfully atheistic, or at least agnostic, playwright James Bridie, graduate of the University of Glasgow, one of the great cultural entrepreneurs of 20th century Scotland, who brings back, in a sense, the mystery play tradition. He's one of the founders of the Citizens Theatre in 1943, and his own work and some other work that we might say fits into the genres of mystery plays and miracle plays, that unproblematically is consumed by the good citizens of Glasgow from the 40s onwards. Glasgow's becoming more relaxed. So too is Scotland. Bridie is a foundational figure also in the Edinburgh Festival. He's one of the main movers behind that festival, also in its opening years, having and Satire of the Three Estates by David Lindsay performed that play that's often seen as a harbinger of the Reformation, and it is in some ways, although I can't help inserting this. Lindsay was never intent on, for instance, transubstantiation being challenged. He was interested in challenging what he saw as clerical degradation, but theologically he wasn't particularly a Protestant reformer. But that whole medieval surge, including the Reformation, is something we're getting back in the 19th and 20th centuries. So that we come to the present day, and like every other good cathedral city, and this happens especially throughout England, actually I don't think Edinburgh has one of these, but Glasgow does, a medieval detective who works around the precincts of the cathedral, the university. And I just want to do almost a free advert because I enjoy the books. Those books by Pat McIntosh, the Gil Cunningham series, The Notary Who Goes Round Solving Medieval Murders. The fact that Glasgow has a set of these shows that medieval Glasgow is secure in the early 21st century. There on the slide we have St Mungo's Robin. Again, going back to the foundational myths around Mungo or Kentigern, Mungo supposedly brought a robin back to life. But certainly, as I say, medieval Glasgow, it's back, it's all around us in this day and age. Most ages never go away. We just reinterpret them, we reimagine them, and there's a lot more to come yet in Scottish literature, art, and other things as we think about medieval Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerry. That was enthralling, absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. And as always, you just don't let us down. Highly informative, very broad ranging, yet highly scholarly as well. We're really, really grateful for the work you've put into that, and just utterly fascinating. And for those regular attenders at St Mungo Festival, yet another indication of how rich Glasgow is and medieval Glasgow is, and now we're viewing it from perspective of literature from different eras. Now I'm going to open up two questions. I'm going to look at the Q&A could I ask now, I've got a lot of compliments here, Gerry.
Nice.
If I could ask you to focus questions in on things that Gerry has said. And maybe I would like to start, Gerry. Very, very intrigued by your comments on John Galt. I'm also a huge fan of John Galt, much underrated. Maybe you tell us a wee bit more about the entail then, and his book in Glasgow.
Well, the entail becomes quite a complicated legal tale where people inherit and are disinherited from property, and it shows people gathering goods. It shows the rise and fall of a particular family in Glasgow that's tied up to some extent with the tobacco trade, with the cotton trade, which is related to slavery, etc., etc. Because there's a bit of a myth that Glasgow and Scotland has an amnesia about slavery. I think that's a kind of overdriven narrative, but I don't want to get too tangential here. Galt is one of the foundational figures in writing about fiction that involves a family through the generations, and is very much a forerunner of the likes of Dickens and Trollope and these other writers who later on are quite openly inspired by Galt, but waltz off with all the credit. Galt needs to be better known by Scotland itself and by the world. If you want one wonderful novel about late 18th, early 19th century Glasgow, for me that is The Entail. And the character studies are amazing. He's brilliant at both showing how people are very good and very bad, sometimes in the same person. He's a wonderful psychologist, a wonderful sociologist, a wonderful observer of theoretical history, as I called it in the presentation.
And we've actually got a question on John Galt. Mark Johnson would like to know, John Galt for a beginner, where do you start? What's a good entry point?
Annals of the Parish. It goes through 70 years from roughly, well, the reign of George III takes in the American Revolution, the French Revolution, all of which is seen through the eyes of a minister in a fictional parish in Ayrshire. It's both micro-history and macro-history. It's very readable. You won't be able to put it down. I seem to be doing lots of adverts tonight, but so it goes. That's just the way it goes sometimes.
John Galt's hit a wee nerve, so we'll stick with him from Janice Bean. Gerry, you mentioned that Enlightenment ideas, brackets Adam Smith, influenced Galt's treatment of historical characters. Could you say a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, well, it's one of my standard jokes is that sympathy isn't invented by Oprah Winfrey. It's invented by Adam Smith, who talks in the Theory of Moral Sentiment, 1759, about looking to the other person. Again, I touched on this a wee bit earlier, and having sympathy with the other person and being able to reach out and identify with identities that aren't our own, a kind of common humanity. And that's what you get in John Galt. You get different classes of people. You get middle-class burgesses, you get tramps, you get men and women, you even get children. You get people of different religions, different races. And Galt, one of the reasons he's a great Enlightenment novelist, and one of the reasons I admire him, is he says that human nature is universal and recognisable, however creed and identity might on the surface be somewhat different. So, you know, Galt is a big Enlightenment mind. The Enlightenment is often seen as a bit rational and even po-faced, and he's a great comedian. He's great at satirising and puncturing small-town politicians, or indeed Westminster politicians. They all deserve it. And so he's just a great satirist and a social observer.
Brilliant, Gerry. Here's a question from Andrew Sterling. Is the regeneration of Glasgow's medieval past in the 19th century a natural part of the Romantic period?
I think to a large extent it is, and that Romantic period that you're rightly referring to comes out of the Enlightenment. One of the things the Enlightenment does that the Romantic period carries on in spades, as it were, is the notion of sympathising with lost causes, with the past, with the defeated, with the marginalised, and not just assuming that mainstream metropolitan identity in the here and now is the only game in town. And that is part of the reason that the Romantic period is interested, with faults and all, in looking at so-called primitive cultures, American Indians, Native American people, or looking at Eskimos, or indeed looking back to the past when our own, if you like, ancestors were supposedly more primitive. The Romantic period is all about saying we're not quite sure that here and now is necessarily the most progressive or best of times. And that, I think, is quite a healthy instinct. In that sense, it countermands the Enlightenment, which classically is progressive, and there's some truth in that, stereotype though it is. The Enlightenment stands for progress, for things getting better. The Romantic period says, hold on a minute, not sure that we go entirely with that, and let's think about different modes of life now and in the past. And very much the Romantic period discovers the medieval period, partly with a kind of reflex that's a wee bit simplistic, because it does kind of think, oh, things weren't as complicated in the medieval period, but of course they were. Things are always, there's always the same level of complexity, the same level of good and evil in the world in all periods until the end of time, if I may be a wee bit theological. And the Romantic period very much sees the medieval times as an interesting platform. The one other wee thing I might say about that is the Romantic period, you think of John Keats, La Belle Dame sans Merci, chivalry, knights, the notion that you could go, in the medieval period, oh, this isn't actually true, you could make a difference as an individual going out and having agency on your own, as opposed to the complicated period that the Romantics were seeing, with the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution. Everything's too big, I can't make any difference in the world. Oh, in the medieval period, you could do that. And all ages kind of think that. Once upon a time, I could have made a difference. I can't any longer. And for me, that's one of the big moral faults of the present. We can make a difference. We ought to make a difference. But that does explain the Romantic aesthetic to some extent of being attracted to the medieval period. And also, we love all past historical periods. There's always something attractive and fascinating about the 19th century or the medieval period, or prehistory, as it might erroneously be called. There are always interesting stories everywhere. And that's one of the things I think that anthropologists tells us, is that we tell and we retell and we remake stories. And actually, in many ways, although I don't have much time for Freud, for instance, one of the things deeply wired in us, in our psychology, is that we are creatures that tell stories. We are creatures of the imagination rather than simply rational, empirical, functional creatures. And thank God for that.
Okay, just before I come to another question, Gerry, you kind of said a couple of times that the 19th century Scotland became a bit more comfortable with its kind of pre-Reformation medieval period. Could you maybe just say a few more words about that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that loosens to some extent, although this is a general thing, is hardline Calvinism. And some people here might be surprised to hear that I'm quite an admirer of hardline Calvinism, in terms of people like Thomas More of Hunters Hill, who was not just the secular apostle of democracy that some people want him to be, or there's some truth in that. These guys were driven by their fundamentalist Calvinism. And if you look at the abolitionist movement, for instance, in the 18th century, a lot of the abolitionists came out of that hardline Calvinism. It was full of integrity. It was quite fundamentalist. And there is some truth in the fact that it was a bit puritanical aesthetically. They didn't like organs in their churches. They didn't particularly like literature, because the only book's the Bible. Keep your eye on that. All other books are the work of the devil. There was something of that. But as the 19th century progresses, Presbyterianism, this has been going on for decades, Presbyterianism becomes more and more moderate, if you like. That's the identity that Robert Burns has a bit earlier. He's a moderate Presbyterian. And that moderate Presbyterianism The same with, other things that are going on in Western and European culture at this time, is more expansive, is more tolerant. Not because necessarily it had been especially intolerant. All groups, all faiths are equally tolerant and intolerant through history. But through the 19th century, that Presbyterianism, which gave a particularly different accent to the aesthetics of church and other life as compared to England down to the 19th century, that loosens up and creates a space for not only itself, moderate Presbyterianism, but for Catholicism, Episcopalianism. Everything becomes a bit more plural, if you like. Yeah. Although always I'm aware, as I say this, there's all kinds of things you would put into the narrative here that says that isn't exactly right, or that's a generalism. But without these generalizations, it's difficult to talk about anything. There are always exceptions.
Yeah. Okay. This is quite a long question, so sit back and relax. From Paul Matheson. In 1936, the Spanish poet Lorca expressed the view that Spain's expulsion of the Moors in 1492 was a cultural catastrophe for Spain. The contrarian Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid knowingly echoed Lorca in the 1940s when MacDiarmid provocatively wrote that the Reformation was the worst cultural disaster ever to befall Scotland. Now the question is, did anyone kind of articulate a version of this view or sentiments prior to MacDiarmid?
Not really. And I think, the reason that we get Paul's very good question there is that both Lorca and MacDiarmid inhabit the period of modernism. And one of the things about the period of modernism, what are they surrounded by? The huge, horrible totalitarian movements of fascism on the one hand and Bolshevism on the other. And guys like Lorca tended to read the Spanish Inquisition as being totalitarian, which it possibly was. And MacDiarmid tends to read, at least rhetorically, the Protestant Reformation in Scotland as totalitarian, as fascist. And actually, I'm not going to defend the Spanish Inquisition. I'm backing myself into a corner here. I'm also not going to attack the Scottish Reformation, because yes, people are killed on both sides, but neither the Spanish Inquisition, treading very carefully here, nor the Scottish Reformation, they're nothing like the mass murderers, Hitler and Stalin. So quite rightly, Lorca and MacDiarmid are very attuned to periods when people seem to be extinguishing culture in a very zealous, intolerant manner. So I've got some sympathy with that instinct, but they overread these things. And the fact is that, MacDiarmid, Edwin Muir does this too. Protestant Scotland wasn't a cultural desert, nor indeed was Spain after the Moors were kicked out. And that, there are tragic consequences there, but some Moorish cultural influences pertain in Spain. And it's also the case that in Spain and in Reformation Scotland, we're talking about nation building projects of slightly different kinds. And what we find, and this is, I have problems with both lazy versions of unionism or nationalism in the present and the past, but we've always got to be careful to some extent of nationalism, because at its worst, it wants to expel, it wants to craft unitary narratives. And one of the things I'm trying to argue tonight is that we should be a bit relaxed, a word that I've maybe overused. It's Glasgow isn't all just about Proddies or Catholics, Proddies or Papists. It's about both of these things who share a history, even when it's contested. And, one of the things that you might be proud about as a Presbyterian, for instance, and the history kind of shows this, is medieval Glasgow. That's your heritage too. Or indeed, if you're a Glaswegian Catholic, you might rightly take pride in some of the history of the Church of Scotland in Glasgow and elsewhere. You can go and worship and have the theology after your own choice, but actually history is something that's broader than that, and we don't need to choose sides. And sometimes when we choose sides or try to sculpt narratives that are too particular, that leads us towards fanaticism. And all the great religions, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, what do they all preach at their core is a message about universal humanity. And so we should try always to remember that the good and the bad are common projects of us all collectively in the past and now.
Yeah, brilliant, Gerry. Now, we've got a question about the St Mungo's Robin author.
Oh, yeah.
Who is it, and are the books fact-heavy, or are they all imagination?
They are well researched, because you can glean quite a lot about medieval Glasgow. There's one, I think it's the St Nicholas Feast book, and these are published, I think, in New York, about a murder in the coal room at the old University of Glasgow. And Pat McIntosh, and I'm not even sure if that's a pseudonym, for all I know, Pat McIntosh is here tonight. But Pat McIntosh has done the research and gives us a very compelling story for a start. That's the bottom line, but also knows about how lawyers and monks and academics and shopkeepers, boothkeepers behave in the medieval period. And so it's not over factual, but there is a very good background flavour to medieval life, insofar as we can retrieve that in any sense. And they're just damn good whodunits. So, I mean, it does tickle me a bit that Glasgow's got that in the way that Edinburgh doesn't. Seems to me there's something, I'm about to be sectarian only towards Edinburgh. There's something different about St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh and St Mungo's Cathedral in Glasgow. Somehow St Mungo's, maybe for obvious reasons, lends itself more.
I don't think it's actually a cathedral, that's why. Technically it wasn't a cathedral, that's why.
Yeah, it was the High Kirk of St Giles.
So it could never have the same position that Glasgow Cathedral has.
Yeah, and it's to do with St Andrews being the archiepiscopal centre for the East, etc. Yeah, but okay. Yes, I would recommend those books.
Final question, because we're going to run out of time, and it's did Dickens write any comments about Galt? And if so, where can we read them?
Oh gosh, now I know for a fact he does. He mentions Galt, but I can't remember where. When I was doing my PhD, 30 years ago, I remember coming across this. Send me an email, kind person, and I can track this down for you. But Galt is explicitly aware of Dickens.
Right. Okay. So Roisin, Roz, if you could then send Gerry an email, and that would be great. Yeah, and just a comment rather than a question from Anne Robertson. It's not a question, but I agree with Professor Carruthers. Pat McIntosh books, great, grand reads. Okay. So I think you've given us loads to read, loads to think about, and loads to take away. Gerry, it's been an absolute delight spending an hour with you. For those who don't work for the University of Glasgow, words like proddies and peeps, these are official academic terms that we use on a daily basis in the university. But it's been an extraordinary hour. Your lecture was, as I said earlier, it's enthralling and illuminating, but the way you've engaged with the questions has been equally illuminating and very, very interesting for all of us. I'm very grateful for you for taking the time to record the lecture, but also to be here to answer questions in your usual very enthusiastic manner. And the Medieval Trust are really grateful that you gave us this time. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for coming along this evening for this inaugural event. I'm so pleased that so many of you have joined us. We have so many great events coming up. On January the 9th, we've got the opening of the Vita Kentigernna. On January the 9th again, we've got Signs and Symbols. We're looking at Glasgow's coat of arms. There's an ecumenical service on January the 10th. There's Mungo, The Legend of Glasgow's Saint, on January 12th, and that's a play by Stephen Callaghan. And of course, we've got the Mollendiner Lecture, Coinage and Coining It in Glasgow, and that's on January the 13th. We really hope you're able to join us for more of these events. We're so pleased that we're able to present them this year. But we're looking ahead. We're looking to this being a hugely successful conference and moving forward to even more successful conferences into the future. And what better way to start the success of this conference than this fantastic hour with Professor Gerry Carruthers. Gerry, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. Thank you.